Lowest common multiples. Remember from last lesson. Now let's suppose you start with 3/8 of a pizza. And then you add 2/6 of another pizza. How much does that make?
Well, you can see you've got 5 pieces.
Yes, but they're not the same size. It's not much good saying you've got 5 pieces if the pieces are of different sizes.
So to add and subtract fractions, the denominators have to be the same.
Correct.
How do we know what denominator?
This is where we need to learn about common multiples.
For each fraction, we need to find an equivalent fraction that has the same denominator.
We've learned how to make equivalent fractions.
For example, we can cut our first pizza further into 20/4 by cutting each piece into 3.
So, the equivalent fraction to 3/8 is 9/24.
We can also cut our second pizza into 20/4 by cutting each piece into 4.
So, the equivalent fraction to 2/6 is 8/24.
Now that the fractions are over the same denominator, we can add up the pieces.
9/24 plus 8/24 equals 17/24.
The hardest part seems to be knowing what denominator to use.
It's not as hard as you think.
When two fractions have the same denominator, we say they have a common denominator. In our example, the common denominator is 24. By doubling the top and bottom, we could just as easily use 48 as the denominator. Well, not just as easily, since we would have been multiplying by bigger numbers. The easiest common denominator would of course be the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator of our two fractions was 24. To make these new denominators, we multiplied the original ones. The new denominators then are multiples of the original denominators. To find the lowest common denominators, we need to find the lowest common multiples of the denominators. Let's look at how to find lowest common multiples, and then we'll see how to use them to add and subtract fractions. First, we'll find the lowest common multiple for 3 and 4.
In other words, we want to find what we can multiply 3 by and what we can multiply 4 by to get the same answer.
I just thought of something. If we just multiply 3 by 4 and 4 by 3, we have to get the same answer. We make them multiples of each other.
Yes, we can do that. 12 is a multiple of 3, and 12 is a multiple of 4. So 12 is a common multiple. But is it the lowest common multiple? Could there be something smaller?
I don't think so.
In this case, there isn't, so multiplying the two numbers together works well.
Let's now try a harder example. Find the lowest common multiple for 12 and 18.
Can't we just multiply them together again?
Of course we can. But will that give us the smallest multiple? And besides, larger numbers are not that easy to multiply. Watch carefully and follow these steps.
Ask, is there a number that goes into both of the numbers?
In other words, is there a common factor?
They're both even, so 2 will go into both.
So, we start by dividing by 2. Can we divide these by a common factor?
Sure, 3 goes into both 6 and 9.
So, we divide them by 3. Can we divide them again by a common factor?
No, only 1 will go into both of the numbers.
Once we reach 1 as the only common factor, we've reached the end.
Wow, that's easy. Now what?
Multiply these factors together to get the highest common factor. The highest common factor equals 2 times 3 times 1, which equals 6.
I've heard it called the greatest common factor.
Same thing.
Multiply the highest common factor by the last two numbers to get the lowest common multiple. The lowest common multiple equals 6 times 2 times 3, or 6, equals 36.
Is this the same as the least common multiple?
Absolutely. Now let's try another example.
Find the lowest common multiple for 5 and 7. Is there a number that goes into both of the numbers?
No, there isn't.
If there isn't, just multiply the two numbers.
35 is therefore the lowest common multiple. That was just a warm-up.
Find the lowest common multiple for 14 and 28. Is there a number that goes into both of the numbers?
Yes. Hey, 28 is just twice 14.
In other words, one number is simply a multiple of the other. In this case, the larger number is the lowest common multiple.
Find the lowest common multiple for 15 and 25. Is there a number that goes into both of the numbers?
Yep, 5 goes into both numbers.
Does anything go into these numbers?
Nope, just 1.
Multiply these factors together to get the highest common factor. The highest common factor equals 5 times 1, or 5. Multiply the highest common factor by the last two numbers to get the lowest common multiple. The lowest common multiple equals the highest common factor, 5 times 3 times 5, or 15, which equals 75.
Now let's use this skill to add and subtract fractions whose denominators are different.
Add these two fractions. 7 24ths plus 11 30ths. We need to have the two fractions over a common denominator.
Which they're not, yet. Can we multiply the denominators together?
Of course, but they're kind of big. Let's look for the lowest common multiple. Now, what number will go into both denominators?
They're both even, so 2 will go into both.
And then
3 will go into both 12 and 15. And that's it.
Multiply the factors to get the highest common factor. The highest common factor equals 2 times 3 times 1 equals 6. Multiply the highest common factor by the last numbers to get the lowest common multiple. So the lowest common multiple equals 6 times 20 is 120. Now we have our lowest common denominator. The next step is to put both fractions over this denominator.
How do we get our first denominator to 120?
24 multiplied by 5 is 120.
And of course, whatever we do to the denominator,
We have to do to the numerator.
5 sevens are 35.
how do we get our second denominator to 120?
30 multiplied by 4 is 120.
And of course, whatever we do to the denominator,
We have to do to the numerator.
4 11s are 44.
Now we can just add the pieces.
35 120ths plus 44 120ths makes 79 120ths.
let's try another example.
Subtract these two fractions. 11 42nds minus 5 28ths. We need to have the two fractions over a common denominator.
Which they're not yet. They're jolly big numbers. Let's look for a lowest common multiple.
Jolly. So, what goes into both denominators?
They're both even. 2 will go into both.
And then,
7 goes into both. And no more.
Multiply the factors to get the highest common factor. The highest common factor equals 2 times 7 times 1 equals 14. Multiply the highest common factor by the last numbers to get the lowest common multiple. The lowest common multiple equals 14 times 6 equals 84. Now we have our lowest common denominator. The next step is to put both fractions over this denominator.
how do we get our first denominator to 84?
42 multiplied by 2 is 84.
And of course, whatever we do to the denominator,
We have to do to the numerator.
2 11s are 22.
and how do we get our second denominator to 84?
28 multiplied by 3 is 84.
And of course, whatever we do to the denominator,
We have to do to the numerator.
3 5s are 15.
Now we can just subtract the pieces.
22 84ths minus 15 84ths are 7 84ths.
let's summarize.
We cannot add or subtract two fractions unless they are on the same denominator. We must first put both fractions over a common denominator. It is not essential, but it is useful to put them over the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator is the lowest common multiple of the denominators.
The best way, the only way to get good at this is to practice.
And to watch this lesson at least 1,000,000 times.
Or thereabouts.
If you would like to make worksheets for this topic, go to www.mathaids.com, click on the fractions topic, and then scroll down until you get to adding two fractions worksheets. Further down, you'll find subtracting fractions. You can also make worksheets specifically for greatest or highest common factors, or least or lowest common multiples. Of course, if problems persist, you can always contact us.